What would you do if the world you knew turned its back on you, leaving you with nothing but the clothes on your back and a memory for a map? What if you were cast out into the unforgiving heart of the Arizona desert, accused of a crime you didn't commit, with only the blistering sun for a witness and the buzzards for a jury? For Sarah Whitcomb, this was no idle question. It was the searing reality of a Tuesday morning in the year of our Lord, 1883. The wagon boss, a man named Silas Croft, with eyes as small and hard as river stones, had declared her a thief, holding up a silver locket for the small assembly of travelers to see. A locket she had never touched, but his word was iron, and hers was dust in the wind. They left her standing beside the deep ruts of the trail, her small canvas bag thrown at her feet, containing little more than a spare dress and her father's worn canteen. But what happened next was not the slow fade into oblivion that Croft had planned, for inside that canteen was more than just a mouthful of warm water. It was the echo of a promise. And in Sarah's mind, the memory of her father's lessons was a compass no man could take from her. Settle in, and let us travel with a woman who was left for dead, only to find a life the world had forgotten was possible. The dust kicked up by the departing wagon train settled slowly, coating Sarah's tongue and stinging her eyes. She stood motionless, a solitary figure in a landscape of immense and brutal indifference. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the parched earth, on the sparse, thorny scrub, and on the crown of her head. Silas Croft's final words still hung in the shimmering heat. "Thieves walk," he'd snarled, his face a mask of false righteousness. "Let's see how far your lies carry you without water." The other travelers, families mostly, had averted their gazes, their silence a form of consent. Fear was a currency out here, and Croft held the purse. Sarah watched until the last canvas cover disappeared over a low rise, a slow, final erasure. Then there was only the vast, humming silence of the desert. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. Panic was a luxury, a fire that would burn through what little strength she had left. She knelt and opened her bag. The canteen, bound in cracked leather and cool against her palms, was the only thing of true value she possessed. Her father had carried it for 20 years, prospecting in hills much like these. She remembered his hands, calloused and kind, holding it out to her when she was a child. "The road isn't always the way, Sarah girl," he'd once told her, his voice rough as granite. "Men make roads, God makes the washes, and water, however small, always remembers the way home." He was gone now, taken by a fever 2 winters past, but his wisdom remained. Croft expected her to follow the wagon ruts, to beg for re-entry or die trying, or worse, to strike out across the open flats, a fool's errand that would end in hours. She looked away from the road, her gaze sweeping the horizon. To the east, a line of broken mesas shimmered, their edges blurred by the heat, and leading toward them, a faint, serpentine depression in the land, barely visible. A dry riverbed, an arroyo. It was a path of last resort, a place where flash floods roared and life was scoured away. To most, it was a dead end. To her father, it had been a map. She took a small, careful sip from the canteen, the water tasting of tin and memory. Then she shouldered her bag, turned her back on the road that had betrayed her, and began to walk toward the ghost of a river. The land was vast, and she was small, but she was not lost. Not yet. She was following a different kind of trail, one made not of wagon wheels, but of patience and stone. The first hour was a trial by fire. The sun climbed higher, relentless and white, bleaching the color from the sky. The ground was a griddle, the heat rising in visible waves that distorted the distant mesas into trembling apparitions. Sarah walked with a steady, practiced gait, a rhythm learned from years of following her father across hard country. She kept her eyes down, scanning the cracked earth, her mind focused on the subtle signs he had taught her. The way the thorny creosote bushes grew a little thicker in the depression, their roots chasing phantom moisture. The scattering of smoother, water-worn pebbles that had no business being this far from a flowing creek. These were the whispers of water, promises of a time when this arid ditch had been a torrent. Croft's face swam in her memory, his lips curled in a sneer. She could almost hear the laughter of the other men, the cruel satisfaction of leaving a lone woman to the elements. They saw her as weak, a piece of baggage to be discarded. The injustice of it was a hot coal in her gut, but she refused to let it consume her. Anger was fuel, yes, but it burned too fast. She needed the slow, steady burn of hope, however faint its flame. Her father's words returned, a calm counterpoint to the imagined mockery. The desert has a pulse, Sarah. You just have to be quiet enough to feel it. She followed the arroyo as it deepened, its sandy bottom soft under her worn boots. The sun beat on her shoulders, and sweat trickled down her temples. But she rationed her sips of water, making each mouthful a deliberate act of survival. The world saw a barren wasteland, a worthless stretch of cracked dirt leading nowhere. They saw a fool's path, a grave waiting to be filled. But Sarah was beginning to feel it, a subtle shift in the air, a fractional drop in the oppressive heat as the shallow banks of the wash rose around her, offering slivers of moving shade. The land was changing, speaking a language of stone and shadow that only the desperate or the patient could understand. What would you do? Trust the dusty road that led you to ruin, or the forgotten path that promises nothing? What secret could a dry riverbed possibly hold, other than the bones of those who had made the wrong choice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. For Sarah, the choice was already made, and it would lead her to a truth buried in stone and shadow. By late afternoon, the shallow wash had carved its way into a proper canyon, the walls rising 10, then 20 feet on either side. The rock was the color of dried blood and old bone, layered in stripes that told a story of time beyond human reckoning. The air in the canyon bottom was noticeably cooler, the sunlight a memory high above the rim. Sarah walked in a world of shadow and silence, the only sounds the scuff of her boots on the sandy floor and the frantic beat of her own heart. The mockery of the wagon train felt distant now, a petty human drama dwarfed by the scale of her surroundings. Yet the memory of their judgment lingered, a persistent ghost at her shoulder. She remembered the whispers, the way the other women had pulled their children closer, as if she were a disease. They had known her for 3 weeks, had shared meager meals and fireside stories with her. But at the first sign of trouble, at the first word from a man with authority, they had cast her out. It was a lesson in the fragility of fellowship, a lesson her father had tried to teach her. He had been a man who trusted the ground beneath his feet more than the promises of men. "The land doesn't lie, Sarah," he'd said, his voice quiet as he cleaned his tools by the firelight one evening. "It can be cruel, it can be hard, but it's always honest. Men do the lying." At the time, she had thought him cynical, a man made solitary by his chosen life. Now, his words felt like the only solid thing in a world that had turned to sand. She saw Croft's face again, not as a memory, but as a symbol of that dishonesty. His accusation had been too quick, too practiced. The silver locket wasn't even something she'd ever seen before. It was a piece of theater, and she had been the sacrifice. But why? The question nagged at her, a puzzle with no pieces. Why go to the trouble of publicly shaming and abandoning her? He could have simply left her behind at a settlement. This felt personal, deliberate. It felt like an execution. The thought sent a chill through her despite the day's residual heat. She pushed it away, focusing on the immediate. The canyon was her world now. Her feet ached, and a deep, bone-weary fatigue was setting in. Her canteen was dangerously light. She was chasing a memory, a piece of a father's faith into the heart of nowhere. Was she a fool? Was this canyon just a longer, slower way to die? The doubt was a serpent, coiling in the pit of her stomach. She paused, leaning against a cool rock wall, and closed her eyes. She summoned her father's face, his calm, weathered features, the certainty in his gaze. He had survived out here for decades. He had known the desert's secrets. She had to trust that he had passed enough of them on to her. She had to trust the canyon. Taking a deep breath, she pushed herself off the wall and continued her journey into the deepening shadows, one foot in front of the other, walking toward a truth she could not yet name. The sun bled out of the sky, painting the high canyon rims in hues of fiery orange and deep violet. Down on the canyon floor, a profound blue twilight gathered, softening the sharp edges of the rock and muffling the world in a blanket of quiet. The temperature dropped with surprising speed, and the heat of the day became a memory. Sarah stumbled, her boot catching on a loose rock. She went down on one knee, the impact jarring her to the bone. For a moment, she didn't move, the exhaustion of physical weight pressing her down. It would be so easy to stop, to simply lie here and let the desert take her. It was a tempting, seductive thought. She shook her head, forcing the weakness away. She had not come this far to surrender to the dark. Pushing herself up, she scanned the canyon walls, now looming and indistinct in the fading light. She needed shelter, a place to pass the night, a defensible spot from whatever creatures, four-legged or two, might prowl the darkness. That's when she saw it. Not a cave, but something less obvious, a deep fissure in the western wall, almost perfectly concealed by a thick, gnarled mesquite bush that had somehow found purchase in the rock. It was a crack, a flaw in the monolithic stone, no wider than her shoulders. Curiosity, a force stronger than her fatigue, pulled her toward it. She pushed aside the brittle, thorny branches of the mesquite, the twigs scratching her arms. The air that flowed from the opening was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone, a scent so alien in this arid landscape that it was like a physical touch. She squeezed through the narrow opening, her bag scraping against the rock. She emerged not into a cave, but into a different world. It was a box canyon, a natural amphitheater carved out of the heart of the mesa, completely hidden from the main wash. The walls curved around her in a protective embrace, their tops open to the first stars pricking the velvet sky. The ground was soft sand, and the silence here was different. Not empty, but full. It felt ancient, sacred. For a moment she was overwhelmed, a sense of having stepped out of time. She had found it, a sanctuary. Her initial hope, however, quickly gave way to a more practical disappointment. It was empty. Just rock, sand, and a few hardy desert plants clinging to the cliff faces. There was no sign of water, no wood for a fire. It was a shelter from the wind, nothing more. But it was enough. She was out of the open, hidden from the world. She found a spot at the base of the towering cliff, an alcove that offered shelter from above. She sank to the ground, pulling her thin blanket from her bag and wrapping it around her shoulders. She drank the last few drops from her father's canteen, the metal disc now feeling hollow and useless in her hands. She laid her head back against the cold stone, her body aching, her throat raw with thirst. She had followed her father's wisdom into this secret place, but it seemed the trail had ended here, in this beautiful, sterile prison of rock. As sleep began to claim her, a profound loneliness settled over her. She was utterly, completely alone. She had traded the cruelty of men for the indifference of stone. She wasn't sure which was worse. Sarah woke to a darkness so complete it felt like a weight on her eyelids. The stars overhead were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds, undimmed by any moon. The air was cold, and she shivered in her thin blanket. Thirst was a living thing inside her, a fire in her throat and a hollowness in her belly. She sat up, her senses on high alert. Something had woken her. A sound. She held her breath, listening. It was faint, maddeningly intermittent, but it was there. A soft, rhythmic plink. 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 It wasn't the sound of an animal or the wind, it was the sound of water. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through her. She got to her feet, moving with a predator's stealth, every muscle tensed. The sound was coming from deeper within the box canyon, toward a section of the cliff face that was lost in the deepest shadow. She moved toward it, her hands outstretched, her fingers brushing against the cold, rough texture of the rock wall. The sound grew slightly louder, more distinct. Plink, plink, plink. It was the most beautiful music she had ever heard. Her fingers found a section of rock that was different, smooth, damp, and covered in a fine, velvety moss. She followed the moisture down, her heart hammering against her ribs. There, tucked into a deep alcove, was the source. A dark stain on the sandstone wall where water wept from the rock itself, gathering into slow, heavy drops that fell into a small basin carved into the stone below. A seep spring, not a gushing torrent, but a patient, persistent miracle. She knelt, her hands trembling, and scooped water from the basin. It was cold, clean, and tasted of stone and earth and life itself. She drank slowly, carefully, letting the water soothe her parched throat, feeling strength and clarity seep back into her. It was life. It was everything. As she drank, her eyes began to adjust to the deeper darkness of the alcove, and she saw that the basin was not a natural formation. It had been carved, its edges worn smooth by countless hands over countless years. She looked up. High above the spring, built directly into the face of the cliff, were the faint, geometric outlines of structures. Windows like vacant eyes, the ghosts of doorways, stone dwellings, nested in the rock like a swallow's colony. This place had been a home. As she stared, mesmerized by the discovery, a different kind of chill ran down her spine. Her gaze dropped from the cliff dwellings back to the spring. There, in the damp sand at the edge of the stone basin, was a mark that did not belong to her. It was the clear, sharp impression of a man's boot heel, the leather worn in a distinctive pattern. It was fresh. The sand was still dark and compressed, hours old at most. A wave of adrenaline erased her fatigue. The silence of the canyon was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. She was not alone. The sound that had woken her was not the only sign of life in this hidden place. Someone else was here. Fear was a cold knot in Sarah's stomach, but it was a familiar fear, one she had learned to manage. Her father had taught her that panic was the desert's most effective predator. She stood slowly, backing away from the spring, her eyes scanning the deep shadows of the cliff dwellings above. She was exposed here, a perfect target. Her mind raced. A lone man in a place this hidden was either a prospector, a hermit, or someone hiding, and people who hid in places like this were rarely the welcoming sort. She retreated to the fissure through which she'd entered, the narrow passage now feeling like her only escape route. But to leave was to return to the waterless wash, to undo the miracle she had just found. No. She had to know who was here. She had to face them. Taking a deep breath, she cupped her hands around her mouth. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse but steady. "Hello?" The word was swallowed by the immense stone amphitheater, the echo dying almost instantly. Silence. She waited, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She tried again, louder this time. "Is anyone there?" A long moment passed. Then, from one of the darkened doorways high on the cliff face, a voice answered, weak and cracked. "Go away." It was the voice of a man, strained with pain. Not a threat, but a plea. Relief and caution warred within her. He was hurt. A hurt man was less of a danger, but his presence still demanded an explanation. "I mean you no harm," she called out. "I need water. I'm just passing through." Another silence stretched, longer this time. She could imagine him up there, weighing his options, his pain against his fear. "There's no one passing through this place," the voice rasped. He was right. Her presence here was as unlikely as the spring itself. She had to make a choice. To take what water she could carry and flee into the night, or to ascend into the darkness toward a wounded, desperate stranger. Her father had been a solitary man, but never a cruel one. He would stop for a man in need, even at his own risk. She saw the path now, a series of handholds and worn steps carved into the rock, leading up to the dwellings. It was a daunting climb, especially in the dark. "I'm coming up," she announced, giving him fair warning. "If you mean to shoot me, you'd best do it now." There was no reply. Taking that as permission, or at least not a denial, she began to climb. The work was difficult, her muscles protesting, her hands searching for purchase on the cold stone. She moved slowly, deliberately, testing each hold before trusting her weight to it. As she climbed, the story of this place revealed itself. These were not crude shelters, but masterful constructions of stone and mortar, fitted seamlessly into the rock. Finally, she pulled herself onto a narrow ledge in front of the darkened doorway. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and something metallic and sharp, the scent of blood. She peered into the gloom. A figure was slumped against the far wall, a long shape in the darkness. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out a man, his face pale and bearded, his breathing shallow. One of his legs was stretched out, a dark stain soaking the rough fabric of his trousers. "Who are you?" he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Sarah Whitcomb," she said, her own voice quiet. "Who are you?" "Don't matter," he breathed. "Did Croft send you? To finish the job?" The name hit her like a physical blow. Silas Croft, the wagon boss, the man who had left her to die. The puzzle pieces in her mind shifted with dizzying speed. This was no coincidence. "Croft?" she said, her voice tight. "He's the one who put me out here." The man tried to push himself up, his eyes widening in the dim light, and then he collapsed back against the wall with a groan of pain. The connection between them, this shared enemy, was a sudden, undeniable fact, as solid as the stone floor beneath her feet. Sarah moved further into the dwelling, her caution replaced by a sense of urgent purpose. She knelt beside the man, her hands automatically going to the wound. The makeshift bandage on his thigh was a torn piece of shirt, stiff with dried blood. His skin was hot to the touch. Fever was setting in. "We need to clean this," she said, her voice taking on a tone of command she didn't know she possessed. He flinched as she gently probed the edge of the bandage. "Leave it. It'll fester," she stated simply. "You'll lose the leg. Or your life." He didn't argue further, his energy spent. Sarah went back down the treacherous path to the spring, her movements now sure and swift. She filled her father's canteen and soaked a strip of cloth torn from her spare dress. The work that followed was grim. Back in the dwelling, she carefully peeled away the crude bandage. The bullet had torn through the fleshy part of his thigh. It was ugly, swollen, and inflamed, but the bullet seemed to have passed clean through. That was a small mercy. Using the precious, clean water, she washed the wound as gently as she could. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white where he gripped the stone floor, but he never cried out. His name, she learned between clenched teeth responses, was Henry Vale. He spoke in broken fragments, the fever and pain making his story a disjointed narrative of betrayal. He was a rancher, or had been. He'd been scouting for new grazing land when he stumbled upon the canyon. Not just the canyon, but the spring. He understood its value immediately. In this parched territory, a permanent water source like this wasn't just a resource. It was the foundation for a town, a future. He had ridden to the nearest territorial office and filed a preliminary claim on the land and its water rights. The land agent he'd filed with was a man who also ran a freight and wagon business on the side. A man named Silas Croft. Croft had recognized the name on the map Vale had drawn. He'd feigned disinterest, but his eyes had glinted with a cold, acquisitive light. 2 days later, Croft and 2 other men had found Henry in his camp, not far from the canyon. They'd asked to see the spring. Henry, suspecting nothing, had led them here. At the mouth of the wash, Croft had pulled a pistol and shot him. They'd taken his horse, his supplies, and left him for dead, assuming the desert would finish the job. But Henry, fueled by a stubborn will to live, had crawled. He'd crawled for a day and a night, back to the hidden canyon, back to the water. That was 5 days ago. Sarah listened, her hands never stopping their work. She found some desert willow by the spring, remembering her father using its bark to make a poultice to ward off infection. She gathered what she could, mashed it between 2 stones, and applied it to the wound, binding it with fresh strips of cloth. His story illuminated the dark corners of her own. Her abandonment wasn't random. Croft was creating a cover story. He was leading a wagon train through the region to legitimize his presence. He needed to get rid of her because she was a loose end, a witness who might remember seeing him near this area. The stolen locket was a lie designed to discredit her completely, to ensure that if she somehow survived and made it to a town, no one would believe a word she said. It was a plan of breathtaking cruelty and cunning. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, clear as a bell. Men do the lying. She looked at Henry Vale, his face slick with the sweat of his fever, his life hanging by a thread. They were 2 strangers, bound together by the treachery of one man. In this hidden canyon, they were all each other had. The desert had not been trying to kill her. It had been leading her here. This was not an end. It was a beginning. Days bled into one another, measured by the slow passage of the sun across the canyon rim. Sarah's life found a new rhythm, dictated by survival. Each morning began with a trip to the spring for water. Then, she would forage, gathering what little the canyon offered. The sweet, fleshy pads of the prickly pear, carefully stripped of their spines. The protein-rich seeds of the mesquite, which she ground into a coarse flour. She tended to Henry's wound, changing the poultice, keeping it clean. Slowly, painstakingly, his fever broke. The angry red around the wound began to fade, and the strength started to return to his voice. He watched her work, his gaze following her with a quiet intensity. The initial suspicion in his eyes was replaced by a grudging respect, and then by something softer. He was a man of few words, much like her father, but his silence was not empty. He told her more about Croft's plan. The wagon boss knew the railroad was surveying a new route 50 miles to the south. A town with a reliable water source situated between the new line and the existing silver mines would be worth a fortune. Croft wasn't just stealing a spring, he was stealing a city. "He thinks I'm dead," Henry murmured one evening, his voice stronger than it had been in days. He was sitting up, leaning against the dwelling wall. "He'll wait a few weeks, maybe a month, then file the final claim papers. He'll say he discovered the place himself. And no one will question him," Sarah finished, her voice flat. "He's a respected man. I'm a disgraced thief." "We're two ghosts," Henry said, a grim smile touching his lips. "That's our advantage. He isn't looking for us." As Henry healed, a fragile partnership formed between them. He taught her how to read the rock, pointing out the subtle seams that hinted at where the water table was closest. She, in turn, showed him the plants her father had taught her to identify, the ones that healed and the ones that nourished. They were learning the language of the canyon together. One afternoon, as the desert sun beat down, a shadow passed over the canyon entrance. Not a cloud, a large bird, then another. Vultures circling high above the wash outside their sanctuary. A cold dread settled over Sarah. They were circling something, or waiting for something. They watched from the concealment of the dwellings as two riders appeared at the mouth of the canyon, their figures small and dark against the bright sand. They were not travelers. They rode with a purpose, their eyes scanning the ground. Croft's men. They had come back to check on their work, to make sure the ghost of Henry Vale was truly gone. Sarah and Henry pressed themselves back into the shadows of the cliff dwelling, their hearts pounding in unison. The men dismounted, their voices carrying faintly on the breeze. They were looking for a body. Their search was a stark reminder that this canyon was not a sanctuary. It was a temporary refuge, a pause in a story that was far from over. If Croft's men found them, or found any sign of their survival, they would not leave them to the desert a second time. The riders were thorough. They worked their way up the wash, their movements methodical and grim. Sarah and Henry watched from their high perch, hidden in the deep shadows of the cliff dwelling. Every snapped twig, every dislodged stone from below sent a fresh wave of fear through them. Henry had a pistol, a heavy Colt with only 3 rounds left, but they both knew that a firefight would be suicide. Their only weapon was the canyon itself, its secrets, its silence. The men passed directly below their hiding place, so close Sarah could see the sweat stains on their shirts and hear the coarse murmur of their conversation. They found nothing. The wash was as empty and sterile as they had left it. Frustrated, one of the men kicked at a rock. "Nothing. Buzzards must have cleaned him up good." The other man spat. Croft's getting jumpy. Once this locked down, let's check for that spring he was babbling about and get out of this heat. Sarah's blood ran cold. They weren't just looking for a body. They were looking for the water. She and Henry exchanged a look of shared terror. If the men found the hidden entrance to the box canyon, it was over. They watched as the riders began to scan the canyon walls, their eyes searching for any sign of green, any telltale fissure in the rock. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. And then the sky began to change. The brilliant, cloudless blue of the horizon began to darken, turning a sickly, bruised yellow. The wind, which had been still all day, began to stir, picking up dust and whispering through the rocks. A low, ominous rumble echoed from the west. A dust storm, a haboob. The desert was coming to their rescue. The riders saw it too. They looked at the approaching wall of dust, then at each other. Their search for the spring was forgotten, replaced by the immediate need for survival. With a shared curse, they scrambled for their horses and galloped back down the wash, racing the storm. Minutes later, the world dissolved into a roaring, orange chaos. The wind shrieked through the canyon, a physical force that tore at the rocks and filled the air with blinding, choking sand. Sarah and Henry huddled deep within the stone dwelling, covering their faces with cloth as the storm raged. It was a terrifying, elemental fury, a display of the desert's raw and untamable power. But for them, it was salvation. The storm lasted for hours. When it finally passed, the world was remade. The sky was a strange, soft ochre, and a thick layer of fine dust coated every surface, erasing the tracks of Croft's men, smoothing over the landscape as if they had never been. The canyon was silent once more, but the silence was different now. Their temporary safety had been shattered. "They'll be back," Henry said, his voice raspy from the dust. "Croft won't give up. Not now." "Then we can't stay here," Sarah replied, her mind clear and resolved. "We can't wait for him to file his claim. We have to get to a real town, to the territorial marshal." "Verde Creek is 2 days' walk from the head of this wash," Henry said, already calculating. "If we travel at night, my leg—" He looked down at his bandaged thigh. It was healing, but it was far from strong. "I can make it." "We'll make it," Sarah corrected him, her voice firm. The choice was made. Their time in the hidden canyon was over. They had to leave their sanctuary and walk back into the world that had tried to erase them. That night, under a sky washed clean by the storm, they made their preparations. They filled the canteen and 2 water skins Henry had fashioned from deer hide. They packed the last of the mesquite flower. As they were about to leave, Sarah paused at the spring, placing her hand on the cool, damp stone. This place had saved her. It had saved them both. She made a silent promise to the ancient, watchful quiet. A promise to return. Then, together, they slipped out of the box canyon and began their long journey toward justice. The journey to Verde Creek was an ordeal of endurance. They traveled by the cold light of the stars, resting during the brutal heat of the day in whatever sliver of shade they could find. The desert they moved through was a different creature at night, a place of deep shadows, strange sounds, and a profound, watchful silence. Henry's leg was a constant source of pain, but he never complained. He leaned on a sturdy branch Sarah had found for him, his face set in a grim mask of determination. They walked side by side, a silent 2-person caravan of ghosts. Sarah found herself watching him, admiring the raw grit that kept him moving. In the canyon, she had seen his vulnerability. Out here, she saw his strength. A quiet respect grew between them, forged in shared hardship and a common goal. Their conversation was sparse, limited to the necessities of survival, but a bond was forming, stronger than words. They were no longer just two strangers united by an enemy. They were partners. They arrived at the outskirts of Verde Creek just after dawn on the third day, haggard, dust-caked, and half-starved. The town was little more than a single dusty street, lined with raw lumber storefronts, but to them, it looked like a metropolis. People stared as they limped down the main street. They looked like what they were, survivors who had been chewed up and spat out by the desert. Their appearance earned them looks of suspicion and pity. Ignoring the stares, they made their way directly to the one-story building marked Territorial Land and Mineral Office. The clerk inside was a small man with a green eyeshade and an air of immense boredom. He looked up from his paperwork, his nose wrinkling at their bedraggled state. "Help you?" he asked, his tone making it clear he doubted it. "We're here to see about a claim," Henry said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. "Filed by me, Henry Vale, for a parcel in the Tortilla Mountains." The clerk sighed, the sound of a man put upon. He shuffled through a stack of papers. Vale. Ah, yes, preliminary filing, water rights, irregular plot." He squinted at them. "You're Henry Vale?" "I am," Henry said, "and this is my partner, Sarah Whitcomb." The clerk grunted, unimpressed. "Well, you're too late. Final claim on that parcel was filed this morning, by a Silas Croft. Very respectable gentleman. Said he found you'd perished in the desert. Even produced a witness to your unfortunate passing." Just then, the door of the office swung open, and Silas Croft himself strode in. He was clean, well-dressed, and carried a leather portfolio. He stopped dead when he saw them, his face draining of all color. For a heart-stopping moment, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost. Two of them. His recovery was quick, but not quick enough. He forced a smile, but it was a brittle, ugly thing. "Mr. Vale, it's a miracle. We all thought you were dead." Sarah stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. "You didn't think he was dead, Mr. Croft. You hoped." Croft's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking to the clerk, then back to them. "I don't know what this woman is talking about. She's a known thief, driven from my wagon train for stealing." "Is that so?" Henry said, his voice dangerously calm. He reached into his boot and pulled out a folded, oilskin-wrapped packet. He spread it on the counter. It was his copy of the preliminary filing, signed and dated by this very clerk. "My filing is dated 3 weeks ago, before your discovery, Croft, and I've got a bullet hole in my leg that says you tried to make sure I never made it here to contest it." The clerk's eyes widened. He looked from Henry's paperwork to Croft's, then back to Croft's pale, sweating face. The whispers started among the few prospectors and townsfolk who had gathered at the door, drawn by the confrontation. The veneer of Croft's respectability was cracking, and the truth, ugly and raw, was beginning to show through. The land office fell silent. All eyes were on Silas Croft. The color had not returned to his face. He was a man watching his future dissolve into dust. The clerk, no longer bored, picked up Henry's paperwork, his fingers tracing the date. He then picked up Croft's. The discrepancy was undeniable, a stark testament in ink and paper. "Mr. Croft," the clerk said, his voice now cold and official. "This is a serious allegation. Attempted murder. Fraudulent claim jumping." Croft tried to bluster, to regain control. "It's their word against mine. A wounded drifter and a common thief. I am a respected man of business." but his voice lacked its usual iron authority. It was thin, desperate. From the back of the small crowd, a new voice spoke, calm and measured. "I'd say it's a bit more than their word." The town doctor, a man named Elias Vance, stepped forward. He had been drawn by the commotion. "I've just had a look at Mr. Vale's leg. That's a bullet wound, not more than a few weeks old, and from the looks of it, it was tended to with surprising skill in the field." He glanced at Sarah with a look of professional respect. "This isn't the story of a man who perished in the desert. This is the story of a man who was shot, left for dead, and survived because of this woman." The townspeople, who had initially viewed Sarah and Henry with suspicion, now looked at Croft with open contempt. Their whispers grew louder, the chorus of public opinion turning against him. Reputation in a town like Verde Creek was everything, and his was evaporating before their eyes. Croft saw it. He saw the judgment in their faces, the end of his ambitions. He didn't say another word. He turned, his movements stiff and clumsy, and pushed his way through the crowd, which parted for him as if he were carrying a plague. He walked out into the harsh sunlight, a ruined man. He wasn't arrested that day. There was still a marshal to fetch, a trial to be had, but his power was broken. His name was now synonymous with liar, thief, and attempted murderer. He was humbled not by violence or shouting, but by the quiet, unshakable weight of the truth. That afternoon, Dr. Vance insisted Sarah and Henry come to his small infirmary. He properly cleaned and dressed Henry's wound, confirming it was healing well. He gave them both a hot meal, the first decent food they'd had in weeks. As they ate, the land clerk came by. "The claim is yours, Mr. Vale," he said, his tone now deeply respectful. "Croft's filing has been voided. The water is yours." Henry looked at Sarah, his gaze clear and direct across the small table. "Ours," he corrected the clerk gently. "The claim is ours." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot stew. In the eyes of this community, she was no longer a thief. She was a partner, a founder. She had walked into the desert with nothing but a memory and had walked out with a future. Her father had been right. The land didn't lie. It had tested her, stripped her down to her very core, and in the end, it had given her a truth to stand on. She had found her way home. Months passed. The fierce heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The hidden box canyon was no longer a secret, but it was still a sanctuary. It had been renamed, no longer a blank space on a map, but a place with a future. Vale's Hope. A handful of other families had arrived, drawn by the promise of water and a new beginning. They were hardy folk, families who, like Sarah and Henry, were looking for a place to build a life on honest ground. A sturdy cabin now stood not far from the ancient cliff dwellings, built from timber hauled down from the high mesas. A small, orderly garden grew near the seep spring, which had been carefully channeled to irrigate neat rows of corn, squash, and beans. The water ran clear and constant in the ditch Sarah herself had helped dig, a silver thread of life stitching this new community together. One evening, at that magical hour when the sun touched the canyon rim and bathed the world in amber light, Sarah was weeding her garden, her hands moving with a familiar, comforting rhythm in the cool earth. Henry walked over from the cabin, moving without a trace of a limp. He stood beside her for a moment, his comfortable silence a language she had come to know as well as her own. They looked out at the small settlement, at the smoke curling from the chimney of a neighbor's dugout, at the sound of children's laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. "We built all this," Henry said, his voice quiet with a sense of wonder. He was looking at the cabins, the garden, the small horse corral, but Sarah's gaze was on the water, the source of it all, the lifeblood that made everything else possible. She thought of Silas Croft and his desperate, greedy ambition. He had tried to build a future on a foundation of lies and violence. He had tried to own the water, to hoard it. But that wasn't how life worked. Not out here. You couldn't own the desert, or the water, or the hope it provided. You could only be a steward of it. You could only build something lasting if you started with something true. She wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek and looked at Henry, at the honest strength in his face, and then at the small, thriving community around them. "You don't build with dirt," she said, the words coming to her with the simple clarity of a revelation. "You build with trust." Thank you for joining us for this story of survival and quiet vindication. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures are not what we find, but the partnerships we forge in the wilderness. If you were moved by Sarah's journey, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll see you next time.